Hi, my name is Kunal, and welcome to the Geeks of the Valley podcast, which connects with some of the brightest minds globally who are leading their respective industries today to discuss the hottest upcoming industry trends and how their work is affecting the global economy. This morning, from Rome, Italy, we have a very special guest joining us, who is a VC and founder of the Parigi family office. Please welcome Giampaolo Parigi. Giampaolo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, Kunal, and welcome everyone to this podcast.
And how are things with you in light of COVID?
Situation here in Europe is getting better, particularly in Italy, where I got stuck in the lockdown. We're out of the emergency, the most critical phase already 3-4 weeks, so can't complain. Unfortunately, not the same in the rest of the world, but we entered the COVID earlier, so I guess we may say we got out earlier than anybody else.
Well, I'm happy to hear that all is well with you. Let's jump into our first question, shall we?
Sure.
Tell me about yourself and your background and how it gave you an opportunity to travel to 75 plus countries across 5 continents.
Okay. Well, I was meant to become a diplomat. That was my initial ambition. And actually, I had 2 passions, being a diplomat and being in finance. The latter prevailed in the end, but I went into my undergrad in Rome at the State University, International Affairs, Political Sciences, and right before I completed my undergrad, I had this realization that I wanted to actually be a financier and operate in investment banking and in venture capital. So I, let's say, redesigned my next steps as a young undergrad to be able to accommodate my ambitions. And back in those days, and we're talking about the mid-'80s, in Europe, well, the notion of private equity wasn't labeled like this. It existed, obviously. It's been around for centuries, but it was not even labeled private equity. There was already venture capital, but most of the activities was in the United States of the, let's say, most institutionalized activity in the business. And so it was only normal that I was looking at sooner or later going to the US to, complete my training, and practice in the industry that I wanted to practice in. And I put myself through an ordeal, which is to get into international marketing. And I started right out of college with 3 other colleagues from the university, an international marketing firm that managed to reach a certain notoriety because we had clients, and not only in Italy, where we were based in Rome, but also in other countries in Europe, primarily Germany. And we managed in about a year and a half in having clients also in the United States. So putting myself into international marketing was fulfilling a very specific parameter in my ideal curriculum to get me to practice on finding concrete solutions to the problems of the manufacturing companies and service companies, distribution companies, because I was inferring that for working in corporate finance, you have to have a an in-depth understanding of how companies function. It is not only about knowing numbers and financial methodologies, which are important, of course, but it's, I think, even more important to understand how companies evolve, what could be their main weaknesses and their main strengths, and they change. They vary from industry to industry and also across geographies. So I felt that practicing in that type of gym would have greatly helped later down the road when I was to enter the financial world on a full-time basis, which it did actually. And so I'm very pleased that I put myself through that eye of the needle. And when it comes to the 75 countries, I've actually traveled to more than 75 countries, Kunal. But yes, I've done business more or less in 75 of them across 5 continents. And when I say I've done business, I mean I've either been a principal investing in any of these economies, or I've been an advisor assisting my clients, both foreign and local, in these economies, or both. In some of the countries, I've been having the privilege of being both an advisor and a principal over the years. So that's been quite an intriguing journey and a very good experience. And let's say that the world doesn't have a lot of mysteries to me by now, after 30 some years in this line of business.
Giampaolo, what an interesting background that you have. Moving into the next question. You are the managing partner and co-founder of the Parigi family office. What is the fund's investment thesis, and how have you chosen to diversify your portfolio as a fund manager? Are you eyeing emerging markets?
Yes, and let me backtrack a moment to maybe complete how I arrived at forming the family office and the underlying philosophy that I had, because that has come a little bit later in my career path. So I've been in venture capital, and I started in Europe, but then I moved to Silicon Valley, and I was the principal in a VC firm there for about 10 years prior to moving back to Europe. Then I was in investment banking business on the board of a mid-size private banking European group with a presence in many countries, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Italy, and the United States. And to make a long story short, after about 15 years in the industry, that was already the 21st century, I decided to start a single family office. Well, my family actually has origins and in trade, tracing back to the Renaissance. We started merchant banking as early as 650 years ago. I think this is the 650th year, this year, 2020. And so, one may say it runs in the family. It might be true. I don't know about that. Definitely, it resonated with me to be in finance. But having had this previous experience of about 15 years internationally on investment banking and venture capital, by the time that I formed my single family office with my family, I had pretty clear ideas and a pretty clear notion of what was necessary to do in private equity to make money and to diversify risks and mitigate risks, and what was supposed to be avoided or dodged. And yes, coming to your additional component of the question, which is, did I eye emerging markets? I did indeed. In fact, I decided that most of our activities as a single family office would have been targeting investments in so-called emerging markets. primarily what we came to know as the BRICS, but not only the BRICS. Private equity is a very interesting play in that it allows, to deploy significant amounts of capital directly onto targets. On the other hand, over the decades, private equity has become a more of an intermediation game whereby the fund managers have been removing themselves more and more from the actual targets that they were supposed to invest in. And what this has provoked is, like in anything else where distance is involved, is a certain lack of proper reaction time when crises erupt or when unforeseeable events occur. Because if you are too far removed from the, let's say, the crime scene, obviously your response time will be slower, and as a result, your economic and financial performance may have, even a significant impact caused by the unexpected events. So what I saw as a defect in the component systems of the private equity, I was really intended to remove it from my own system. And there were two ways to go about it. One was to reduce this distance between us as an investment entity and the actual ultimate target that we were eyeing. And the second was to structure the transaction in a way as to, as much as possible, de-risk the venture. Now, I've mentioned that we were primarily interested in the emerging markets because when we started the single family office in the year 2000, I had already accumulated about 15 years on emerging markets as an investment banker and an advisor. And those emerging markets were primarily the Commonwealth of Independent States, China, Southeast Asia, the Emirates, and India. So those were regions of the world where we were, determined to leave a footprint and to make a mark and to get our benefits and results. As you very well know, emerging markets being aptly named such, there is a reason for the labeling, and then the fact that some of the, let's say, rules of engagements and rules of law that we had in more advanced economies at the time that I started doing this were not yet completely enabled into the systems of, into the judicial, the economic, and the juridical system of the emerging markets. And as a result, compliance meant different things under different jurisdictions and different skies. What we meant by governance in the West was not necessarily reflected in a deal that was supposed to be completed in former Soviet Union or in China. And by the same token, capital markets compliant in many of these countries rang as a very hollow proposition, because obviously there was not a secondary market even to speak of. And so, the meaning of terms I've realized in my peregrinations around the world for business over the decades has taken on different meanings to different people. And I have an example for this, but then just to not to diverge and not to respond to your question, but I think it's interesting to notice. For example, under so-called communist system, when we were talking about the former communist countries, when you mention the word profit, and if you had somebody from the West sitting at the table, profit means normally whatever remains, below the bottom line, when everything else has been taken away and removed from the P&L and the balance sheets. And what I've discovered, profit meant in socialistic economies was a totally different concept, and it had a total different meaning. profit was something that had a more extensive social implication and sound. Basically, it was more of a collective result for a number of stakeholders versus, the single individual result for an individual entity. And and a lot of things get lost in translation when you deal with foreign cultures, because you tend to think that what you are saying, and even if you use the same language, in this case English, I'm giving this example just to show you that it didn't mean anything actually. There were so many things that could potentially get carried away and lost in translation just because under different skies, people consider certain terms as having different meanings. And hence you can have misunderstandings. Misunderstanding definitely lead to time waste and opportunities that could be lost. And ultimately, even transactions can be lost or put in jeopardy just because of this very simple yet very subtle differences across different cultures. And now, fast forward to going to the point that I had to be in terms of answering the question. So on emerging markets, as a single family office, we needed to make sure that the components in a transaction that we were going to enable in a Western style of transactions could also be possible to enable them in a transaction on the emerging markets, meaning corporate governance was supposed to be there from day one. I definitely wanted that, and I wanted to have a capital market compliant deal. What do I mean by this is I wanted to be able to exit the transaction in the emerging market at a certain EBITDA multiple that was more or less equal or similar to the multiple that I would obtain in a similar transaction in the Western economies. Now, in order for us to do so, obviously, we had to take a certain number of precautions. And in emerging markets, I would say the crucial area to address where you could find most of the dangers was the due diligence and the fact that you could have, if you bought into existing legal entities, so existing ongoing concerns, you could actually buy into hidden liabilities. And by this, I mean, liabilities that could, like skeletons out of the closet, come out at a certain point in time, possibly when your venture was already, active and with the cash register tingling. And at that time, in a foreign, possibly even hostile environment, having to deal with those complex issues and skeletons out of the closet could have been very detrimental, not only for the venture, but also for all its stakeholders. Now, thanks God, I had been in those markets long enough before starting my investment program. So I knew that this was a risk that I had to neutralize from day one. And the only way that I knew how to neutralize this was basically starting deals anew. So really from greenfield, as we said, the family office decided to invest primarily across 4 silos, 4 verticals, these being maritime infrastructure, because this is the operating domain of my family. So ports, marinas. And the second silo was integrated logistics, advanced logistics. So anything that has to do with transshipment facilities, intermodal transshipment centers, distribution centers. The third one was renewables. We've been investing in biomass plants and solar parks. And the fourth one was healthcare, primarily assisted living senior home facilities. Now, the bulk of our investments has been done in the first 3 pillars of the 4, and whereas in Europe or in the United States, we could invest also in so called brownfield targets, so companies already and entities that were already operating in emerging markets. We definitely decided to go on to greenfield only, because this for us was the only way that we knew on how to de-risk a venture, basically to reducing the risks to near zero, because obviously we were incorporating an investment vehicle and the operational vehicle all made by us with no history behind, so no possibility of having skeletons in the closet, no hidden liabilities whatsoever. And everything was as crystal clear as a glass of water. And so definitely it could pass peer review when I was going to my fellow investment bankers in the West. And it was satisfactory also for the co-investors that came with us. And we have had over time, we had over 70 investors from different lines of business, strategic investors like multinational and middle market companies. We've had ultra net worth individuals, we've had investment funds, and some global banks. So basically, I would say nearly the full spectrum of the colors of the rainbow have been coming with us, which is a testimony to the fact that we were building good ventures that were understandable, and they were trying to mitigate the risks. Of course, I mean, a portion of physiological risks always remains in every business venture that you do, but we mitigated greatly by adopting this I would say very basic precautions of doing only deals that were originated, started, managed, and executed, and ultimately sold by us. So we didn't buy into anything existing. Now, this model was working so well that we actually used it also in the West. In fact, some of the largest transactions that we've done also in our family offices have been done in the West on greenfield deals, namely the development of the largest marina facility in the Mediterranean Sea. But this is basically to answer your question about our investment model and the fact that we were going primarily towards emerging markets. And emerging markets were always attractive for us because, in a nutshell, we could pursue double-digit or triple-digit figure returns with a risk profile that was, thanks to our methodology, those risks were the same as we had in the West. So we had really mitigated and normalized the venture in emerging markets as if it were a venture based in the West. But the advantage, the good flip side of the coin in emerging markets was that returns were much higher because, of course, of the economies in emerging markets. We are more ebullient, more turbulent, faster growing on a percentage basis on any given year compared to the growth of the more mature economies.
Giampaolo, around the age of 24, you had set up your own marketing company and offered an opportunity to broker a massive deal between Russia, the Soviet Union back then, and the United States. Can you tell us more about this opportunity and how you set yourself up for a position like this at such a young age?
Yes. Yeah, it was not a massive transaction, but it was a very complex transaction. And I would say and the further aggravation came from two additional elements. One was that I was just a rookie out of college, of course, with clear ideas, with good, bright partners that were as young as I was, but still, we were, in our infancy in business. And second was that we were talking about the moment in which there was still the Iron Curtain. We were on the verge of an epochal transformation in which former Soviet Union, as we knew it, was crumbling down to pieces, but at that time it was still on. In fact, the venture started under Soviet Union and it was completed and signed in the Russian Federation. That was the the child, the offshoot of the demise of the Soviet Empire. I mean, the main country that resulted out of the disgregation of the Soviet Empire. So, and that took me about 2 years of my career to do that deal. Yeah, basically, I received a call by one of my United States clients. There was another marketing firm like ours, and the senior partners in this marketing firms required me to help them, to assist them in this transaction having to do with Soviet Union. And my first answer was, no, absolutely not. I cannot help you. I cannot do anything in that regard because, you know, I've never been there. I don't know the market. I don't know anything. I don't have any contacts. And anyway, you know, it's a closed country for foreigners. You need special permits to travel there, and not only the visa, you had to really have very good reasons to go to these markets. But my American colleagues insisted that for a variety of reasons, I could be the only one that could try to assist them. And of course, they wouldn't have, you know, put all the pressure on me to if I weren't able to do this, because they understood that it was a very difficult, complex transaction. And so basically, a little bit with the flexibility that they demonstrated and the fact that I felt that they really needed help and that they didn't have anyone else to help them with, or that they trusted as well as they trusted me, I decided to take on the engagement. And basically I worked with my team 2 years representing the U.S. interests in the former Soviet Union for completing what it was then one of the first joint ventures ever signed between government agency in Soviet Union and private U.S. interests. And this was a very good transaction because I received numerous accolades out of the transaction. The first was that I got an understanding of an emerging market for the first time in my life. You know, in business, I could understand deeply what it meant to be, you know, another type of regime, another type of economy. And that was the so-called the second world at the time, you know, because all the countries under the communist regimes were the second world, and, you know, the rest of the world was the so-called third world. And I mean, nowadays these comments would sound derogatory, but, you know, still at the beginning of the 90s, they were used even on international mass media on a daily basis. Just to get you the context of where we stood at the moment. So one of the things that I learned was, you know, as I say, an understanding of different systems and how their modus operandi really worked on a daily basis, and what was their decision-making process and how it differed from ours, and trying to reconcile everything in a legal manner and in a manner that was conducive to conclude a transaction that had implications and involved not only two countries and two systems, but also some other different countries in Europe, because there were a number of suppliers from Germany and Italy involved in this transaction. So actually it was, to say the least, a 4-country exercise, you know, with the 3 countries from the West and one behemoth from the East. And this was very good, and also another accolade that for me became, I mean, a matter of great honor and prestige, and also helped me a lot in any future businesses that I have received the honorary citizenship of the United States because of entrepreneurial contribution. So for having fostered the commercial relationships between the United States and the USSR, you know, the American government gave me this much coveted award. I think I was at the time probably youngest foreign national ever awarded at the age of 25 for entrepreneurial contribution, and the honorary citizenship of the US. And so that was, as I say, a matter of great honor for me. And of course, I never set about doing that deal, thinking that I could receive such a recognition. I did it because I thought that I had to service professionally my clients and that they needed help, and I tried to make the best out of it, and for every stakeholders. And but what I've also learned out of this, and I would say that's the last component of my answer, is I learned that there was a large part of the world that was really growing, and where I could do business at a profit, legitimately, of course, by bringing together under the same roof, under the same umbrella, entities and cultures that were different in many aspects. And so there was, let's say, something that I've been leveraging on immediately afterwards, because I remained and kept working in those markets. And from those markets, I've ventured out to China, which happened when I was already then living in the United States. And mutuating from the early lessons I learned in former Soviet Union. Of course, there was a lot of good that I could use also in communist China, and then also I've used this experience in other emerging markets around the world, and then there was a tilting point by which, simply by virtue of having been in the market for over 2 decades, I got called more and more as, as an expert, quote unquote, for emerging markets. I never self-styled as an expert of anything, and let alone emerging markets. But it is obvious that there are not a lot of investment bankers from the West that had the type of experience that I have in those markets, for sure, on a I would say nearly daily basis, because I spent months of my entire years in those markets, really with boots on the field to build the transactions that I was supposed to build, either as a principal or as an advisor.
This perfectly jumps into our next question. You are a polyglot who can speak around 10 languages. How has this helped you manage to do business in different parts of the world? And how has knowing the local language of a certain place allowed you to further develop those relationships?
Well, it definitely helped me a great deal. I must say that I speak those languages I would say, with decreasing order of quality as we move from the first to the 10th. But obviously, yes, I do understand all of them. And I would say I have a basic knowledge and basic communication skills in all of them. Well, the benefit is that, well, it makes your job easier in that you feel more attuned with the environment. The second benefit is that makes your local counterparts, acting totally different towards you, because it is true that you could use a lingua franca like English to communicate in most parts of the world, not only nowadays, but also 20 or 30 years ago. Although I have recollection of when I went to Germany, and I didn't have German at the time. I've learned it on the field later on. And so I was using English in Germany, and I said Germany is not an emerging market. I remember that especially the elder generations not only didn't speak English, they also had recollection from World War II, English being the language of the enemy. And there was really, I would say, an invisible barrier by which English was really not working if I had to deal with potential clients or associates who were, let's say, in their 60s or 70s when I was in my early 20s or 30s. So these people had seen the war, these people had, clear memories, and for some reason it still evoked in their soul a certain resistance to shift to English. So as a result, in Germany, I had realization that in order to do business there, I really had to have German. I mean, or at least a basic German. And probably I've been very lucky because I get a knack for languages, and it's the same gift for music, and it comes easy to me, and it really helps. And when it comes to languages of a certain common roots, like for example, Western languages, European languages, of course, once you've learned a few of them, the rest of them come very easily, because obviously you can, it's like a jigsaw that, the more pieces you put in order, the faster you go with the remaining pieces. But definitely it helps a lot. I think what it boils down to, if I have to really summarize it in a sentence, is the fact that you show that you provide respect to the people that are your gracious hosts in that country. And I think respect being the most important component of anything in life, before anything else kicks in, even in a personal relationship, respect is a baseline foundation of anything else. Even in love, without respect, there's no love. I think that building on respect, which is a two-way street, so you give respect and you must obtain respect back. But more often than not, when you give respect, you get respect back. So I think it really helps. And I would recommend to anyone that has the possibility of or an ease to learn foreign language and to adapt to foreign cultures, to do so, because in business it helps. And as I say, you could do it in English, but if you have the local language, it would still help you to go to, let's say, unfathomable depths in understanding who you're sitting in front of, and understanding where they come from, and that all helps you to achieve your objectives, and in a win-win situation, so that everybody is a happy camper at the end of the transaction.
Moving into our second to last question. You have so many experiences, especially during the time we've had this call. You've talked about a lot of different things. And these are experiences many would, potentially wish for. But a lot of these experiences have probably come with a lot of uncertainty and risks that cannot always be calculated. How do you deal with the uncertainty of life and what it throws at you?
I think that that's a matter of discipline. It's a very good question. And I think it has to do a lot with what you think of yourself, what you want to achieve in your life. So what's your destination, and the fact that you must have a good navigation system. If those things are already embedded in you, I think everything gets easier, and definitely I had it. It's not something that comes out of the blue, and it's something that you must work on. I remember having worked on certain items as early as when I was 16 years old. So, and not for a business reason, just because I was becoming who I ended up becoming. So I think it's, then business is a consequence. You do it in a certain way because you are who you are. Definitely, I am a very non-conventional investment banker in that I was not coming out of an Ivy League university, although the undergrad university in Rome is very famous for what I was studying, for political sciences. But coming to the investment banking business, I was not coming out of a business school. I then completed my PhD later on in business, but I was already working and operating on a daily basis as an investor and an investment banker. So it's a different angle. As out of the box as you can imagine, and uncertainty is a part of life. I think it's the same uncertainty that pilots live with and sailors live with. And other categories, professional categories, may not think of this as something that you have to deal with on a daily basis, but the truth is you have to. Everybody deals with uncertainty, whether he or she realizes it consciously or not. And so this should not be, let's say, an inducement towards inaction. In other words, fears should not paralyze you. Concerns should exist, because if you're not concerned, you're totally delusional or even crazy, and doesn't make for a good business person. So you have to have concerns when you operate in foreign, uncharted territories. But as I say, this should not lead to being paralyzed by fears or by anxiety. I think you have to factor it in that a certain degree of uncertainty is physiological. Just like pilots, even if they have charted and they have the weather report and they've charted the route, they cannot mathematically be sure that they will not encounter turbulence, moderate to heavy turbulence sometimes. They still fly, and they know what they can do in terms of corrective actions in case they have to reroute the aircraft around maybe a weather front. But they are not limited in their mobility, and they're not limited in their daily actions. Airplanes fly every day. Vessels circumnavigate the globe on a daily basis, be they tankers, freighters, roll on, roll off. And you can imagine pilots being afraid of turbulence, sailors being afraid of the waves of the sea. We would have a real paralysis of the global trade as we know it. Now, it doesn't happen. Why? Because, a certain modicum of uncertainty is factored in every system and is factored in every professional analysis. So when you adapt to that, you have to be very disciplined, of course, to work on a global basis as I do. You have to have a sort of, I think, of a military discipline or background that would greatly help you, because if you are too lax or distracted or I would say superficial in your dealings, chances are you will not survive in this environment, and you can even put yourself and your life in peril in some dangerous parts of the world, like frontier countries, for example. So you have to be always, attentive and alert. And again, one way to do this is to remind yourself that uncertainty is part of the equation, and your ability must reside in keeping that component not exceeding a certain threshold over which it becomes predominant in the variables quantification, and of course then it becomes very dangerous. But if it is within a physiological limit, well, you gotta live with that, because if you had 100% information, you wouldn't even be making a decision. You would have been presented with factual evidence, and on a factual evidence, the decision is simple. Reality is that all of us in our professional and business lives have to take on decisions where the 100% of information is not available. So the ability lies in tackling issues and taking decisions where you have, and I'm using the figures a little bit liberally here, but please bear with me on not only the numbers and just trying to pass the notion of what I need to convey. We need to have a certain, let's say, degree of accuracy that should be 65, 70% and upwards. And of course, as it nears 100, it gets better and better, but we cannot guarantee that on all decisions we will be near 100% of the information available. Pilots have to decide when they have 90% of the information available. So do sailors and many other categories. Think about doctors, in a surgical theater. They have to operate a patient, and they don't know if the patient will live or not. But nonetheless, they have to go and do it. So of course, you don't jump in the dark. You're trained to do what you have to do. You still analyze the single individual case that you have in front of you, be it a patient, a trip on a route with an aircraft, or a transaction for an investor or an investment banker. But definitely without action, there's nothing in life, and action entails and carries with itself a certain degree of uncertainty. So I think that's how you have to deal with this. I hope I've answered your question.
Giampaolo, you've perfectly answered it. To wrap up the call with our last question today, what piece of advice would you give to people out there from the journey you've had thus far in life?
To hold the course, stay the course, and remain persistent. And because, in business, so whether you're a business person running a manufacturing operation or a distribution company, or even a service company like a consulting firm, or you're an investor, be it institutional or quasi-institutional or even individual, I think you have to remain, once you have made your determinations, you should remain convinced that your determinations have been taken with the best degree of accuracy and information that you could have at that particular point in time. And so, stay the course is what I could recommend, because, it's always darkest before dawn, we say in the US, and it holds true for many things in life, and there's, there's a moment in which as you sail off on the sea, out at sea, you lose sight of the coastline that you left, and you don't yet see the coastline that you have to land on. And so you see oceans all over and a sky above, and a sense of fragility and loss may be a human reaction to have, but you have to remember that you've plotted your course, and your waypoints. And so you should keep, having trust in what you plotted, if you have, prepared accordingly, obviously. That's why there's no room for improvisation. I always invite, especially as a venture capitalist, I invite companies that are not ready to raise capital to go back to the drawing board and spend maybe another few months there, and get out of their neck of the woods only when they're really, really ready to speak with investors, because they have just one chance and they might burn it if they're not ready. But once you've done that, then you think you've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's. I think you should go for it, and as I stay the course.
For people that want to contact you, what would be the best point to reach you at?
Well, they can reach me through my personal website, which is giampaoloparigi.com, or via LinkedIn, or also via direct email on my personal email address, which is giampaoloparigi1@gmail.com, and 1 is written as a figure number.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Geeks of the Valley.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this podcast.